Welcome to Sunderland Talks. I'm Helen Edmonds. Today we have a returning guest to the podcast. Dr. Helen Driscoll joins us again. For those listeners who didn't hear the last podcast we did with Helen, you can find it on our usual podcast channels. She joined us with Professor Clarissa Smith to discuss sex robots last time. Today, though, we're looking at a completely different subject, body image. I'll do a really quick intro about Helen's background, just in case people haven't heard the last podcast. So, Helen's an evolutionary psychologist, and her research interests include sexuality and sexual behaviour, dark personalities, and higher education pedagogy. So welcome back, Helen.
Hi.
So we've chosen this particular subject because we're recording the podcast during Mental Health Awareness Week, and this year's theme is body image. So according to the Mental Health Foundation, body image is how we think and feel about our bodies. So that's the topic we're going to cover. So I'm going to bring in Helen's expertise now. So from an evolutionary perspective, how has the ideal body shape developed throughout history?
Okay, so people often think that body image ideals come from the media because we tend to see a particular kind of body portrayed in the media. And I think it's more the case that the media is reflecting and maybe amplifying something which is already there. So over evolutionary time, we've evolved to behave in ways which help us to survive and reproduce. And that's affected our bodies as well. So, for example, we have preferences for particular body types. So if we think about the female body and the kind of idealised images we see of that and the preferences that people have, there are particular types of female body shape that we see represented quite a lot and that people tend to have a desire for. So there tends to be quite a preference for a curvaceous female body with a waist-hip ratio of around 0.7, which is an hourglass shape. And the reasons for that are thought to be, for example, that a slim waist, so an hourglass shape is a combination of two things. It's a slim waist and relatively wide hips. So a slim waist indicates an absence of pregnancy. It possibly indicates that someone hasn't had a child before, or maybe hasn't had many children. But also the other side of it is the preference for quite wide hips. And people tend to think anecdotally that that's due to childbearing hips, and it's a bit more complicated than that. So one of the things which seems to be attractive about wide hips is that on the buttocks and the thighs there's a particular kind of fat which is stored there, and it's used in developing the brain of a fetus. Okay, so women who have that kind of ideal waist-hip ratio, there's some evidence that they have offspring with better cognitive ability.
Wow.
So the idea that beauty's only skin deep is a little bit blown away when you look at evidence like that actually the shape of the female body can affect the brain and cognitive development of their offspring. So there is a preference for that. There's also some evidence that kind of waist-hip ratio is linked to better health and fertility, which is why we would expect that men would have a preference, heterosexual men would have a preference for that kind of body shape in a woman. Slimness generally is associated with better health and fertility. It's not as straightforward as people think, though. So people in the Western world often have a preference, it seems to be a preference for really, really thin bodies. And that's not really adaptive because the thinner you get, as you get really, really thin, your BMI drops. Fertility really, really does decline to the point where periods can stop, for example. So what the evidence suggests is that extreme thinness isn't the most attractive body shape. And some researchers looked at, what happens to attractiveness ratings as female body images get slimmer and as they get bigger. So as they get bigger, what we see is a more gentle decline in attractiveness ratings, and that's because as you put on lots of weight, there is some impact on health and fertility, some negative impact, but it's much more gradual. So putting on a little bit of weight, we wouldn't expect to have a very big impact. But in contrast, as images get really, really thin, what we see is a really sharp decline in attractiveness ratings, and that's because it has a really quite alarming effect on fertility. So what the evidence suggests is that in terms of body shape, to sum up, curvaceousness and slimness, but not extreme thinness, are relatively attractive. It does differ across different cultures. So, for example, if you prime participants in research studies, if you prime them with news stories about economic harshness, that seems to affect their body preferences. So in harsher conditions, we have preferences for a slightly larger female body, for example, because that indicates better resources. So it's not a kind of thing that's completely consistent across cultures. It is adaptively sensitive to different situations.
Great. So we've covered a lot about sort of the ideal female body.
Yeah.
How would it work for men?
Okay, so for men, what we tend to see, if you look at all of the news stories about the effect of, say, idealised body images, there's a lot of talk about the effect on women, isn't there? But actually, there's probably just as much of an effect on men. And likewise, as evolution has shaped the female body preference in a particular way, there's been a similar effect in terms of female preferences for male bodies. But what women look for in a male body is something that's a little bit different. So there tends not to be a really strong preference for slimness. The ideal male body shape seems to be around having a kind of triangular torso with really wide shoulders, a slightly narrower waist, but it's about strength and muscularity, because in the environment that humans evolved in, that kind of a body shape would have signalled strength and the ability to protect, possibly things like hunting ability and the ability to provide. It would have also signalled good genes, so in the way that the sort of ideal female body shape signals fertility and good genes, the ideal male body shape signals something which was important to women, which is strength and good genes. So evolution has shaped male preferences for male bodies. Similarly, it's just the qualities we look for are slightly different.
Yeah. Sort of bringing the mental health perspective in a little bit. One thing that comes up a lot when the discussion of mental health comes up, it's about comparing ourselves to other people.
Yeah.
So I wonder if we'd talk a little bit about the fact that in ancestral times we wouldn't have seen that many people compared to, I can go on my social media now and look at millions of people if I wanted to on Instagram, and how that affects our mental health.
Okay, so that is a really important point, because these preferences developed in times when we lived in fairly small groups. In ancestral times, we lived in hunter-gatherer groups that were quite small. We didn't have very many people to compare ourselves to. We do have a natural tendency to compare ourselves to each other, because when we're looking for a partner, for example, on some level we are competing with other people. Really what we're trying to do is get the best partner that we can get. Now that might be in terms of attractiveness or resources or compatibility, but there is competition with other people. So what affects our mental health more now is the fact that we don't live in those small groups anymore. We're living in a globalised world where we live in a really competitive environment. We're surrounded by lots of people. For example, teenagers go to school with usually hundreds of other people. The average comprehensive school is really big now, and they're surrounded by lots and lots of other people to compare themselves to. If you add to that we live in a globalised world with a global media, where we are bombarded with images every day, whether it be in the newspapers or on Instagram or on the web or wherever it is, we can see lots and lots of examples of different body types. And we have an innate idea about what that ideal body type is, and we can compare ourselves to lots of people around us. And if we feel that, our own bodies are in some way, if we're making some kind of negative comparison with the images that we see, then it does affect self-esteem. Now, that's not to say that it always results in mental health problems, and it can, and for some people it does, but it is a little bit more complex than that. So, for example, the idea that media images cause eating disorders, yes, it plays a role, and this tendency to compare ourselves with each other, it does play a significant role. But the causes of eating disorders are really complex, and if the media solely was responsible for that, then everyone would have eating disorders, and that isn't the case. So I think we have to be a bit careful about thinking about the extent of the role of these things, but they do play a role, and that highly competitive environment surrounded by all of these images, it does have some impact.
Yeah. Social media comes up a lot, and we were discussing it just before we came in to record. So one of the questions I had was about, does social media and traditional media exacerbate all of these, our body image issues? Can't think of a better word.
Yeah, I think it does exacerbate them, and I think that's the right word. So it's often suggested that social media and the more traditional media, where you see in newspapers all of these bikini-clad images of celebrities, and then on Instagram where people might follow celebrities with quite extreme body shapes, and even more extreme things like the inspiration accounts and all of these sorts of things. So I think it's all of that definitely does have an impact, but I think it is an exacerbation rather than a cause, because preferences for particular body shapes are there, they've been there for a long time, and although they vary and there are individual and cultural differences, there really are quite strong individual differences in preferences for body shapes. But on average we have these particular preferences, and so what the media are doing is, perhaps without knowing it, picking up on the fact that already we have these preferences. Media will be more successful if it portrays images that we pay attention to, and we have an innate preference and probably an attentional bias for those kinds of body shapes. So the media in essence makes more money really by playing to that, and so they portray these images that we already have a preference for, but they do portray them in often quite extreme ways. So for example, if you look at some video games, that Lara Croft, for example, is a really idealized image. It's an extreme form of the preferences that we have. So some of the idealized images that we see are not realistic, and to strive for them does lead to significant problems sometimes. But that's not to say that, for example, looking at images of healthy bodies that are slim and fit, that is necessarily a bad thing, because body shape is linked with health, and so pursuing that kind of body shape to some extent within reason isn't necessarily a bad thing, I think.
Yeah, I quite like the point about social media not being a cause.
Yeah.
Because we've been bombarded with images of the perfect body for centuries. There's paintings going back hundreds of years of the ideal body shape, and obviously that has changed through history.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good point to make. What I'm going to ask you a question that I don't actually know if you'll be able to answer this, if there is any research about it, but on social media there's a lot of, you can use filters to change how you look. There's even apps that completely change your whole facial structure. And I was just wondering if there was any sort of research, or if you have an idea of why people want to change the way they look so drastically. Why you would want to completely change the shape of your nose, for example.
So I think in terms of preferences for facial attractiveness, I think what all of these filters are doing is they're allowing us to make our faces look the way that we would ideally want them to. And again, as I've talked about evolved preferences for body shape, we have evolved preferences for facial beauty as well. So if we think about women, the kinds of things which are attractive are symmetrical faces. That's true for men actually as well. Symmetry is attractive. The reason that symmetry is attractive is we all start out with a predisposition to be perfectly symmetrical, and no one actually is, because all sorts of things affect the expression of those genes. But in general, the more symmetric you are, the more attractive you are, and that's because the causes of asymmetry are to do with mutations in genes is one cause, but also what we call developmental instability. So a poor developmental environment where you might have experienced, for example, infection or poor nutrition, those sorts of things will affect the symmetry of your face, and all of those things have an impact on what we might call overall fitness. And so symmetry is something which is very attractive, and so some of these filters kind of iron out asymmetries in your face and make you look very symmetrical. The other thing that they do is smooth the skin. So smooth skin is also attractive. That's an indicator of health and good genes as well. And all sorts of things cause issues there. It can be things like hormonal imbalances, again, developmental issues, infections, diseases. A huge variety of things can have an impact. And in terms of, say, looking at a potential partner, those sorts of things can tell you that, in some way there's maybe been some effect in terms of genetics or environment that is not ideal, and therefore we do strive to have smooth skin, and so filters are one means of achieving that. I think in terms of male facial attractiveness it is slightly different. So symmetry again is attractive, but also whereas in females we look for a kind of smooth face with what we call neotenous features, so big eyes, for example, enlarged lips and those sorts of features. What's more attractive in men are features which indicate higher levels of testosterone. So a square jaw, for example, indicates quite high levels of testosterone. But it is complicated because for men, there's a kind of double-edged sword around testosterone. So on the one hand, high levels of testosterone, which give you that masculine face and that square jaw, can be very attractive to women because they signal things like dominance and, again, ability to protect and those sorts of things, which used to be important in the ancestral environment. Not necessarily saying that those things are important now, but we still have those preferences. But the other side of testosterone is that it does make you susceptible to infections and diseases, and so testosterone only tends to be attractive if you can withstand the harmful effects. So if you have those masculine features, but you also manage to be healthy, that's a really good indicator of good genes. It's something that we call immunocompetence. It means your immune system can cope with the harmful effects of those high levels of testosterone. So it's quite a complicated balancing act for men in terms of that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think people will enjoy that. And I mean, I've mentioned before I studied psychology, but there's certain things you forget or, relearn or hear new information about, so that's really interesting to hear. I wanted to sort of mention sort of body positivity is a big thing at the moment, and there's a lot of hashtags and social media accounts that cover that. So there's the hashtag iWeigh account, body posi panda, body positive accounts and of people sort of sharing love your body type messages. And I thought another interesting side of it is body neutrality, where the way that you view your body is just, instead of saying I love my body, it's just my body works in a certain way, so you don't feel positive or negative about it. You just think my legs help me walk. That is, it's very neutral. What's not really a question, I just sort of wanted to mention it as it's quite an interesting point. I don't know if you've seen any of those types of accounts on social media.
I think it's something that we've got to be really careful about. So there's a huge concern about the effect of really slim or sometimes extremely thin images, and that is a real concern. As I've said, the causes of eating disorders are more complex, but that is one factor. It does play a role, I think, in the exacerbation of eating disorders, even where it doesn't cause what we might deem an eating disorder. As I said, it does have an impact on self-esteem. So I think the body positivity movements are a counter to that, aren't they? I think they're trying to get away from the harmful effects of exposure to really thin images. But I think we've got to be careful because there's a danger of going too far the other way. It's never a good thing to feel bad about your body, and things like body shaming and fat shaming are very harmful. They don't seem to cause people to lose weight, so all of that is really harmful. On the other hand, in terms of body positivity, I suppose if that's taken too far, if we give the message that extreme obesity is perhaps in some ways a good thing, we've got to remember that whilst extreme thinness causes all sorts of problems, extreme obesity is harmful as well. In terms of medical issues in the Western world, obesity is a major factor. So I do think we've got to be a bit careful about getting the balance right. Body neutrality, that's an interesting one. I think I can see the benefits of that. I suppose the danger of that again is if we ignore things like obesity, then we're not really going to be able to tackle the harmful effects of that either. So I think ideally we would try and promote to some extent fitness, more healthy lifestyles, realistic bodies that are healthy, I think is a good thing. So it's getting the balance right.
Absolutely. Yeah. So in terms of we're not here to solve any problems. I wish we could, but it's a bigger issue than us. And when I was looking on the Mental Health Foundation's website to see what sort of things they had there about the body image theme for this week, they were talking about being more intentional with social media use. So following more body positive accounts, or even deleting things from your phone that if you think every time I log on to this particular social media app it makes me feel bad, they suggest removing them. Or even just simply start partaking in more life-affirming activities
Yeah.
outside of social media, you know, see our friends, you know, just put technology to one side and just live life, I guess. And I was just wondering if you had any sort of suggestions.
Yeah, again, I think it's a balance. So I think that if you delete everything from your social media that would portray, say, thin women, that's almost stigmatising thin women, I think, and there's an issue with that. There's possible issue around avoidance. You know, we can't avoid these images completely, and some of it is around developing the resilience to deal with the fact that we do naturally compare ourselves to one another, and in some ways we will be able to make positive comparisons, and it's not, you know, just all about bodies. It might be about your abilities in various ways. It could be about your personality. So I think we have to some extent live with the fact that we naturally make these comparisons, and sometimes we'll find those positive and sometimes not so much. So I wouldn't personally think that complete avoidance is the answer, but also I think that if all of your social media is filled up with following, you know, accounts which are just filled with unrealistic images of extreme thinness, for example, that isn't healthy. That is probably going to cause you some harm. That's not representative. So I think it's about getting a balance of, you know, accepting maybe some of that, but making sure that you expose yourself to things which help you, which make you feel good, and really it's about doing things which help you to be comfortable with your body. I think to some extent body positivity is a good thing when it's, you know, it's not about sort of saying there's no harm in extreme obesity, but it's about accepting that actually there are lots of very different body types which are healthy and attractive. So I think just following a range of things and not avoiding things necessarily unless they're really harmful, but having a good balance. That's what I kind of personally think.
Yeah, that's great, thank you. And for any podcast listeners, the Mental Health Foundation's got some good resources on their website to have a look at too, if anybody just want to see what the whole body image theme is about this week. So I've come to the end of my questions. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to mention, Helen?
No, I don't think so.
No? Okay, well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.